I'm Triggerman 1976, and this is the BLOGCAST. I'm glad you're here today, because in this video, we're going to be looking at a video that was put out by Ben, the Amateur Exegete, and we're going to look at some issues that he raises in it that have to do with New Testament reliability in general. And I just thought it'd be worth it to look at it. We're going to be picking up at about halfway through the video. Of course, I have timestamps, and I also have all the links for the videos that we're going to reference below in the description. The video we're going to be looking at is titled Cracks in the Foundation on J. Warner Wallace's Case for Gospel Reliability. So let's jump into it, because this is going to be a long video. In setting up for his inspection of Wallace's argument as it appears in Cold Case Christianity in general, and specifically in the video that Ben will be referencing, Wallace gives us 3 criteria for the reliability of a witness. And that includes whether the witness was present, whether there was some general external corroboration for statements, and whether that testimony changed over time. And in light of that criteria, this is what Ben says.
But if Wallace's argument is an edifice, then the foundation upon which the pillars themselves are built is the assumption that the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses or based in eyewitness testimony. Since a building is only as good as its foundation, the presence of cracks should throw into doubt the structure's soundness.
Okay, good point. Because Ben is very deliberately paced to be exacting, and the video itself is rather long, I've sped it up to 1.25 speed. So let's listen to the first crack in Wallace's argument.
The first should be fairly obvious to anyone who has read through the canonical Gospels. They lack the kind of first-person narration one would expect of an eyewitness account. Take, for example, the Gospel of Matthew, which was purportedly written by the tax collector mentioned in Matthew chapter 9, verse 9. If Matthew wrote this account, why does he narrate it in the third person? Instead of reading that Jesus saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth, why don't we find something like, Jesus saw me sitting at the tax booth? And instead of the words, and he rose and followed him, at the end of the verse, why don't we find, and I got up and followed him?
Let me just ask, is there some rule that Matthew has to narrate in first person? And if he did do that, wouldn't that put the spotlight on him rather than the subject of his examination? Let's go on.
We have plenty of examples from antiquity wherein authors used the first person to communicate something they were personally involved in seeing or being a part of. For example, the historian Thucydides, writing in the 5th century BCE, writes in his work on the Peloponnesian War, I lived through the whole of the war, studying it with mature perception and in the intellectual pursuit of an accurate understanding of events. Similarly, in his Jewish War, the 1st century CE historian Josephus tells his reader, I shall not conceal any of the calamities I myself endured, since I shall relate them to such as know the truth of them.
Well, that would seem to assume that Matthew or the other gospel writers were writing histories, which is a specific genre of Greco-Roman literature. And that's exactly what Thucydides and Josephus were writing. They were writing histories. However, Richard Burridge has demonstrated in his study of the Gospels as literature that the Gospels fit into a literary genre called bioi, which is typically written at the popular level as a character study of a particular individual. But let's go on.
Moreover, what do we do with those passages that describe events for which Matthew could not have been an eyewitness? Since in the chronology of the Gospel of Matthew, the tax collector was not present for any of the events prior to chapter 9, how is it he knew the content of the Sermon on the Mount in chapters 5 through 7, or the details of the miracles found in chapter 8? If the answer is that he talked to those who were there, then what we have presented to us isn't an eyewitness account, but hearsay. That is, This isn't first-hand information, but second-hand at best. And it isn't only the episodes before his call that Matthew would have missed. How did he know about Judas's visit to the chief priests, wherein he was paid to betray Jesus, or the details of Judas's regret and subsequent suicide? If all the disciples deserted Jesus, as Matthew chapter 26 verse 56 records, then how did he know the details of Jesus' trial-like appearance before Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin? Or the conversation between the Jewish religious authorities and Pilate, in which they decide to set a guard at Jesus' tomb. The idea that the Gospel of Matthew is an eyewitness account functions to raise more questions than it answers.
Well, the fact that the Gospels fit into the literary genre of bioi actually explains this, because, as Burge discusses, the narrative of bioi is centered around a particular method of presentation. Either it begins with the birth or public entry of a figure. It will contain a series of dialogues or speeches or anecdotes that will kind of flesh out the narrative. And then it'll eventually transition into perhaps discussing the decline or even the death of the individual under consideration. Regarding issues of chronology, Mike Licona, in his book, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? He points out that most chronologies in ancient texts are what they call synthetic chronologies. That is, the author might not know the exact order of events. So what does he do? He creates a chronology that makes sense and helps the narrative move along. Also, when it comes to understanding what is meant by the term eyewitness account, what is generally meant in regard to the Gospels is eyewitness accounts, plural. So Jesus' ministry occurred in the presence of a community, and that community came together and contributed their remembrances to the whole story. This means that the Gospels can't be separated from the reality of that context. Similarly, they can't be separated from one another. They are all part of the same network. It's not something that we as Westerners accept, but it was absolutely common throughout the ancient Near East. So what I'm hearing from Ben is the perspective of a modern Western individualist who doesn't seem to understand how historiography has been done, especially in an ancient context. But we continue.
A second crack in the foundation of Wallace's contention is related to the first. The evangelists never named themselves. In an article that appeared in Novum Testamentum in 2008, Armin Baum noted that there was a tendency among Greco-Roman historians to either begin or end their works with their name and location. For example, Herodotus opens his history of the conflicts between Greece and Persia by writing, Herodotus of Halicarnassus here presents his research so that human events do not fade with time. Similarly, Thucydides, who I mentioned a short while ago, opens with the words, Thucydides of Athens wrote the history of the war fought against each other by the Peloponnesians and the Athenians. Josephus, too, follows suit, identifying himself as Josephus, the son of Matthias, by birth a Hebrew, a priest also, and the one who at first fought against the Romans, myself, and was forced to be present at what was done afterwards. Baum, taking stock of these and other examples of Greco-Roman histories, writes, on the basis of these observations we may conclude, if a Hellenistic historian did not mention his name in the prologue of his work, he deviated from an ancient and widespread literary convention.
The evangelists never named themselves. So what? They weren't Hellenistic historians. Moreover, on page 130 of that same study, Baum writes, by writing anonymously, the New Testament narrators were closer to Hebrew than to Greco-Roman historiography. He also goes on to point out that Matthew and Mark present themselves just like Old Testament historiography. And he continues by noting that while Luke and Acts adopt certain Greco-Roman characteristics and conventions in the presentation there, they still remain anonymous in that same Old Testament style. Why is this, you might ask? Well, Baum answers that in the abstract to his paper. Unlike the Greek or Roman historians who wanted to earn praise and glory for his literary achievements from both his contemporaries and posterity, The history writers in the ancient Near East sought to disappear as much as possible behind the material he presented and to become its invisible mouthpiece. By adopting this stylistic device, the evangelists of the New Testament implied that they regarded themselves as comparatively insignificant mediators of a subject matter that deserved the full attention of the readers. Almost like the answer was in front of him the whole time. Continuing.
A third and final crack in the foundation of Wallace's view has to do with the literary relationship of the Gospels themselves. While it is true that for virtually the entirety of the last 2 millennia, the Gospel of Matthew was considered to be the first of the 4 canonical Gospels to come into being, the last 200 years of critical scholarship has not only called that into question, but has all but cast so-called Matthean priority into the dumpster of history.
And they do this by simply ignoring historical testimony and engaging in some serious fallacious reasoning. Now, if you're curious about my view on the Synoptic Problem, you can see this post right here on the blog, which will be linked below. And if you want to read about a different opinion on how to solve the Synoptic Problem, you can also check out David Allen Black's book, Why 4 Gospels? It's interesting, it's approachable, and answers a lot of questions.
Instead, Matthean priority has given way to Markan priority, such that, in the words of Stanley Porter and Brian Dyer, it has been the majority opinion regarding synoptic origins.
Opinions are like armpits. Everybody's got them, and they stink.
This shift to Markan priority happened for good reasons. Time, unfortunately, does not allow a full examination of those reasons.
When you drill down into most of those reasons, they're largely theological and are often based on unevidenced assumptions. Now, the next section of the video was a little long, so in the spirit of full transparency, it's still at 1.25 speed. However, there were several instances of dead air that I went in and clipped out, which roughly cut about 30 or so seconds out of the entire runtime.
Instead, I want to show why Matthew's dependence on Mark spells trouble for the notion that the Matthean Gospel is based upon an eyewitness. Let's return to the calling of Matthew found in Matthew chapter 9, verse 9. The parallel passage is in Mark chapter 2, verse 14. Here is my translation of Matthew's version. And while walking along from there, Jesus saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax office, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he rose and followed him. Here is my translation of Mark's version. And while walking along, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax office, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he rose and followed him. In my translation of these two texts, I have rendered identical Greek words and phrases with the exact same words. So, here are the two texts with those words and phrases that are identical, placed in bold. It might not be strange that 2 independent witnesses are in agreement that Jesus issued a 2-word command to the tax collector, nor would it be strange that they would agree on the exact same 2 words. But what is strange is the narrative framing of the command. How likely is it that 2 independent witnesses would use the exact same language, right down to the choice of verbs and tenses? Moreover, given Markan priority, why would Matthew, as an eyewitness to his own calling, choose to pretty much go with what Mark said, rather than offer his own unique perspective? Something doesn't add up.
There's something we need to notice here, and it has to do with Ben's own narrative framing, specifically regarding the term independent. First of all, why should we think of Matthew or Mark as independent witnesses? To answer Ben's question, though, I would like to point out that Matthew, as someone in the ancient Near East, would not see himself as an individual with a unique perspective. Instead, and we're just going to assume Markan priority here for a moment, just for the sake of the argument, Matthew would see himself as part of a community, and that community was endowed with a tradition which he had a responsibility to convey. And if he had something to contribute to that, either from his own testimony or by having access to other witnesses, then anyone receiving his gospel would benefit from it. See, as a conveyor of tradition, Matthew would be under no obligation to transmit what he received in utter exactness, nor could he be freewheeling with it. He's free to present the narrative as he sees fit in accordance to the tradition that was received. It's just not something that many of these people think of. Continuing.
This is not the only place where that happens, and it seriously undermines the claim that these are two independent eyewitness accounts. Someone is depending on someone else, and it looks to be like Matthew is relying on Mark.
Why can't Mark rely on Matthew? It simply depends on what you're willing to assume. And see, this is one of the issues with redaction criticism in general, is it has to make a number of unjustified assumptions about the relationship of texts. And then it treats those assumptions as if they're facts, but they're not. Its primary error is it ignores the fact that the authors were not modern Western individualists, but they were part of a community with a shared tradition. The Gospels were written inside of a community for that community. It just always seems to be ignored. There's one thing though, and I think that Ben misunderstands Wallace at this point, especially when it comes to the term independent eyewitness accounts. In fact, Wallace never calls the Gospels by such terms. The closest that I can find is in a quote from page 183, which reads, "When I first read through the Gospels forensically, comparing those places where two or more Gospel writers were describing the same event, I was immediately struck by the inadvertent support that each writer provided for the other. The accounts puzzled together just the way one would expect from independent eyewitnesses. When one Gospel eyewitness describes an event and left out a detail that raised a question, this question was unintentionally answered by another Gospel writer, who, by the way, often left out a detail that was provided by the first Gospel writer." So Wallace was merely speaking in comparative terms, and only in regard to those places where missing details in one could be filled in by details found in the other. Now, Wallace goes on to note that such interdependence had only one of two reasonable explanations: intentional collusion, or that eyewitnesses played a part in writing the Gospels, providing essential distinguishing details that only they would know. Something to think about. Ben closes.
So, it doesn't matter if the Gospels are early, or if certain details are corroborated by archaeology, or this or that ancient historian, or even if there's a chain of custody. The foundation of Wallace's argument, the assumption that the Gospels are eyewitness accounts, is itself compromised due to these three significant cracks. If it crumbles, down comes the entire building.
Well, not so fast, Ben. As I've demonstrated, none of the issues that have been raised are relevant. In fact, they have to force a number of things onto the text, such as incorrect literary genre, which when you do that, it forces the wrong standards onto them. And as one of the very sources that he appeals to demonstrates, you just have to make unjustified assumptions about the literary relationships of the Gospels. Simply put, Ben wants to hold the Gospels to the wrong standards, and it's based largely in the fallacious reasoning that underlies Markan priority. And that has to ignore the cultural and historical settings of the Gospels, not only in their production and subsequent distribution, but as texts themselves. That being said, if you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up. And while you're at it, please share it with your friends. If you don't mind, hit that subscribe button. Again, I'm Sugarman1976. Thank you for watching. God bless. Have a good day.